9,500 pounds of carved volcanic rock, 9,000 feet above sea level. No roads, no wheels, no metal tools, and the ground is frozen solid for 7 months of the year. Explain that. Because mainstream archaeology couldn't. For over 100 years, they couldn't. They found these things, massive polished stone monoliths carved into the shapes of giant fish.
At the structure's center stands the stone circle, or henge.
When most people hear of Stonehenges, they think of the Stonehenge in England, but there are hundreds of these henges or stone circles scattered all across Europe.
Scattered across the most brutal mountain terrain in the Caucasus, and the best explanation they could offer was probably religious. That's not an explanation. That's a confession of failure. There are over 100 of them up there, in the Armenian highlands, some taller than a 2-story building, some heavier than a loaded pickup truck. The locals call them vishaps, dragon stones. For over a century, nobody dug deeper. Case closed. File it under ancient mysteries and move on. Then, in 2025, a team from Yerevan State University did something no one had ever bothered to do before. They actually ran the numbers, all of them. Every stone, every elevation, every carving, every water source within walking distance. And what they found didn't just reopen this case, it destroyed the old one entirely. These weren't monuments, they weren't decorations, they weren't some primitive shrine to a forgotten god. They were a blueprint, a 6,000-year-old engineering schematic, carved in stone, that mapped the entire water system of the Armenian highlands. And every civilization that came after, they built their cities on top of it, without even knowing it was there. Stay with me on this one, because by the end, you're going to look at the ancient world very differently. The year is 1909. 2 Russian scholars, Mar and Smirnov, are digging around the Temple of Garni in Armenia when local villagers start telling them stories about dragons in the mountains, about massive stone creatures lying in the high meadows where the shepherds take their flocks in summer. The scholars hike up, and there they are, enormous slabs of basalt, some taller than a man, carved with eerie precision into fish shapes, eyes, gills, mouths, tails, every surface polished smooth, except the bottom. That part was left raw, rough, like it was meant to be jammed into the ground. They sketched a few, measured a few, published a paper, and then nothing. The research went cold for decades. Here's what bothers me about that. Because here's the part that should have kept those early researchers up at night. A stone they later cataloged as Caucasus 3 weighs 9,500 pounds. It sits at an elevation of 9,200 feet. The ground up there is frozen solid from October to May. There's no shelter, no food source, no water that isn't locked under ice. Someone organized a crew. We're talking dozens of people minimum, fed them, sheltered them, and coordinated them to quarry a block of volcanic rock, carve it with precision, polish it by hand, and then haul it uphill through alpine terrain. In a window of maybe 4 or 5 snow-free months. You don't do that for a decoration. You do that when the location is everything. In 2012, a joint team, Armenian, German, and Italian researchers, finally decided to treat these stones like a crime scene instead of a curiosity. They went to a site called Tirinkatar, high on the slopes of Mount Adagats. 12 dragon stones, all clustered together, the densest concentration ever found. They pulled 46 organic samples from the soil around the stones, charcoal, bone fragments, and ran them through carbon dating. Same technique cold case detectives use to pin down when a body was buried. Except these detectives weren't dating a body, they were dating a civilization. The results came back, and the room went quiet. 4,200 to 4,000 BCE, 6,000 years old. That means when these stones were being carved and hauled uphill, Stonehenge didn't exist yet. Wouldn't exist for another 1,000 years. The people who built these had no written language, no iron, no bronze, just copper, stone tools, and an obsession powerful enough to move mountains, literally. But that wasn't the part that changed everything. The team mapped all 115 stones by GPS, altitude, size, carved motif, and proximity to the nearest water source. They had a simple, logical hypothesis. Bigger stones at lower elevations where the work is easier. Smaller ones higher up where conditions are brutal. The data came back wrong. Dead wrong. There was zero correlation between stone size and altitude. The biggest, heaviest vishaps were just as common at bone-crushing alpine heights as they were in the valleys. The builders weren't taking shortcuts at altitude. If anything, they were working harder up there. And then, and this is where I got chills the first time I read this, a pattern emerged in the carvings themselves. The fish-shaped stones, the ones with the gills and the eyes and the tails, they cluster at the highest points, right next to natural springs, right where snowmelt begins its journey downhill, the birthplace of water. The hide-shaped stones, the ones that look like stretched animal skins, they sit lower, in valleys, alongside ancient irrigation channels, near the roots where livestock grazed and settlements grew. Fish at the top, hides at the bottom, water borne high, water used low. You see it now, right? This wasn't random. This wasn't superstition. This was a map, a 6,000-year-old stone-carved schematic that tracked water from the moment it melted off a mountaintop to the moment it irrigated a field in the valley below. Fish where water is born, hides where water is used. The dragon stones were the original infrastructure grid. Now here's the part that should make you angry. A scholar named Ashkarbek Kalantar proposed this exact theory, that the vishaps were markers for a prehistoric irrigation system in the 1920s, 100 years ago. He was dismissed. His work was shelved. Nobody followed up. The 2025 study proved him right, on every count. The stones cluster at two very specific height zones. One group sits around 6,000 feet, high but reachable. The other, nearly 9,000 feet, the roof of the world. And those two zones aren't random. They line up exactly with two critical stages in the highland water cycle. The upper zone, where snow melts and feeds the mountain springs. The lower zone, where that meltwater finally reaches the valleys and becomes something you can drink, farm with, and survive on. The researchers traced later settlements along these same corridors, classical-era villages, medieval churches, Urartian fortresses built centuries after the Vishap builders vanished. All of them, sitting on the same water routes that the dragon stones had marked thousands of years earlier. 6,000 years of continuous human settlement, following a blueprint laid down by people who never wrote a single word. Let that settle for a second. And then there's this. In 2024, archaeologists excavating a vishap at Latitude, near Lake Sivan, found something underneath the stone that made the room go quiet. 2 infant burials. Not beside the stone, beneath it. These weren't passive markers. People made offerings to them. The most devastating kind of offering imaginable. Whatever belief system surrounded these stones, it ran deep enough that parents placed their children at the foundation. So the question nobody in mainstream archaeology wants to sit with is this: how did a society with no written language and no metal tools beyond soft copper engineer a watershed management system so accurate that every single civilization that followed, for 6 millennia, built their world on top of it without even realizing what they were following? Here's a thought that's going to follow you around for the rest of the week. 6,000 years ago, a group of people with no written language, no wheels, and no tools harder than copper looked at a mountain range and understood something that most modern governments still haven't figured out. They carved that understanding into stone and dragged it to the highest, most permanent places they could reach. Because a message anchored to a mountaintop at 9,000 feet outlasts every empire, every religion, and every government that will ever exist. Now here's the part that should keep you up tonight. Armenia is currently classified as a country under extreme water stress. In 2024, the Akopian Center for the Environment at the American University of Armenia put it plainly: The country's water availability is going down. The underground water basin beneath the Ararat Valley, one of the most fertile regions in the country, is shrinking every single year. Agriculture alone swallows nearly 90% of Armenia's water supply, and in May 2024, catastrophic floods tore through the northern provinces of Lori and Tavush, the same highland corridors where dragonstones have stood for millennia, destroying homes, roads, and farmland. The World Bank has committed $435 million over the next decade to try and fix Armenia's water infrastructure. $435 million to solve a problem that a Copper Age society solved with stone, manpower, and the radical belief that some things need to be built to last forever. And that's the real lesson the Dragonstones are teaching us. Not just about water, about how we build. About whether we design our systems for the next election or the next 6,000 years. About whether we have the courage to do something brutally difficult today, because the people who come after us, people we will never meet, will need it to survive. The vishap builders will never know that their grid outlasted every empire in the region. They'll never know that pilgrims still leave offerings at their stones. They built it anyway. What are we building that will last that long? So tell me, after everything you've just heard, the impossible logistics, the sacred water grid, the infant burials, the $400 million crisis unfolding on top of a 6,000-year-old blueprint, what do you believe? Are these stones proof that a lost civilization understood something about survival that we've completely forgotten? Or is all of this just coincidence? Type Lost Empire or Coincidence in the comments. Subscribe to Hidden Latitude, because the truth is rarely on the surface.